When spring gave way to early summer in 1945, the war across the European continent had finally drawn to its bitter close, though for thousands upon thousands of German soldiers the conflict was far from over in their minds. These men, who had fought through the ruins of French villages, who had been surrounded and captured in the massive encirclement known as the Ruhr Pocket, who had laid down their weapons in the hills of Italy, now found themselves being herded like livestock onto massive transport vessels that would carry them across the cold, grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The journey itself was long and uncomfortable, the holds of these ships packed tight with defeated men who still wore the tattered remnants of their uniforms, fabric that had once been pressed and pristine now hanging from their frames like rags, loosened by weeks and sometimes months of insufficient rations, of hunger that gnawed constantly at their bellies. Yet despite their physical condition, despite the obvious reality of their defeat, something remained unbroken within many of them, particularly among the officer class. It was a kind of stubborn arrogance, a refusal to acknowledge that perhaps the worldview they had been taught, the ideology they had served, might have been fundamentally flawed from its very inception. By the time June arrived and the weather grew warm across the American heartland, these transport ships began unloading their human cargo at various ports along the eastern seaboard. From there, the prisoners were loaded onto trains that rattled westward, carrying them deep into the interior of a country most had never seen and knew only through propaganda films and distorted reports. They were distributed among dozens of camps that had been hastily constructed across states like Kansas, where the land stretched flat and endless beneath enormous skies, Texas, where the heat shimmered in waves above the parched earth, and Iowa, where cornfields rolled like green oceans as far as the eye could see. When the gates of these camps swung open to receive them, when they shuffled through in their worn boots while dust devils swirled around their feet, coating their already dirty uniforms in yet another layer of grime, many of these men carried themselves with a bearing that suggested they believed themselves still superior in some fundamental way to their captors. This was especially true among the officers, men who had commanded units in battle, who had led other men into combat, who had grown accustomed to deference and obedience from their subordinates. One particular afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly on one such camp and the prisoners huddled in whatever shade they could find within their barracks, word began to spread through the ranks that the Americans intended to feed them in something the guards called a cafeteria. The very pronunciation of this foreign word seemed strange on German tongues, and almost immediately it became a source of mockery and derision. In one barracks, a lieutenant who hailed from the northern city of Hamburg rose from his bunk and addressed his fellow prisoners with all the confidence of a man who believed he understood the world perfectly. His voice dripped with contempt as he declared that such a ridiculous word could only refer to some cheap establishment, perhaps a tavern of the lowest sort where workers might drink away their wages, or perhaps a lunchroom for school children, a place utterly devoid of any dignity or proper ritual. He went on at length about how these Americans, these brash and uncultured people from across the ocean, understood nothing whatsoever about the proper way to conduct oneself at table, about the traditions and ceremonies that elevated a meal from mere sustenance to an expression of civilization itself. Their meals, he insisted with absolute certainty, would be as crude and childish as everything else about them, as noisy and cheap and utterly tasteless as those garish Hollywood films that had sometimes made their way to German theatres before the war. His comrades, hungry and tired though they were, found themselves chuckling at his words, nodding in agreement, adding their own observations about how only in the fatherland, only in Germany with its ancient traditions and deep culture, was the act of dining treated as the art form it truly was, with dignity preserved and protocol observed even when the nation itself was being bombed into rubble. The irony of this conviction, of course, was almost painful in its obviousness, for the truth was that many of these same men had not enjoyed what anyone might call a full meal in months, some perhaps not in more than a year. Bread, when they could get it, had been scarce and often adulterated with sawdust or other fillers to stretch the flour. Potatoes, once plentiful, had been carefully rationed, each man receiving only a meagre portion. As for meat, that had become almost a memory, something they dreamed about at night but rarely tasted during their waking hours. Their bodies had grown thin, their ribs visible beneath their skin, their faces gaunt with the kind of hunger that becomes a constant companion. And yet still, inexplicably, their pride remained stronger than their physical need, as though clinging to this sense of superiority was the last thing they had left to hold on to. Many of them, when they closed their eyes, could still see in their mind's eye those officer mess halls from earlier in the war, rooms panelled in dark oak that gave them a sense of weight and permanence, tables covered in white cloths that had been starched and pressed until they gleamed, sausages arranged on platters with geometric precision, wine bottles that were opened with ceremony and ritual, each cork pulled with deliberation as though this simple act carried profound meaning. For these men, the memory of such meals was less about the food itself, though the food had certainly been better than what they had eaten in recent times, and more about the performance of it all, the theatre of hierarchy that played out at every sitting. There was comfort in knowing one's place, in understanding the order of things, in the way junior officers waited for their seniors to be seated first, in the way silence was maintained until the ranking man at the table gave the signal that conversation could begin. To these Germans, the act of dining meant order, it meant discipline, it meant a connection to something larger than themselves, and they had assumed, with the certainty of the truly ignorant, that the Americans possessed none of these qualities, that American meals would be chaotic affairs, shoveled down without thought or grace. What none of them knew, what they could not have known because the information was not available to them and because it would have contradicted everything they had been taught to believe, was that by the year 1944 the United States Quartermaster Corps had achieved something that no military supply organization in the history of warfare had ever accomplished. The logistics system that the Americans had developed, refined through trial and error and constant innovation, had reached a level of efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. This system was capable of supplying not merely the millions of American soldiers fighting on 3 separate continents, spread across the Pacific Islands and the European theatre and North Africa, but also the hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war who were being held in camps scattered across the American mainland. In that single year alone, American farms, those vast agricultural enterprises that stretched across the Great Plains and the Midwest and the fertile valleys of California, had produced more than 24 billion pounds of meat, an almost incomprehensible quantity that represented the combined output of millions of cattle and hogs and chickens. The flour mills that dotted the landscape, their great wheels turning day and night, had processed more than 120 million barrels of wheat, grinding the grain into flour that would be baked into bread and biscuits and cakes. Entire trains, some of them stretching for what seemed like miles, thundered across the heartland, carrying milk in refrigerated cars, vegetables packed in ice, sugar refined from beets and cane, all of it flowing toward the coasts and the ports and eventually across the oceans to feed an army that numbered in the millions. What awaited the German prisoners, though they did not yet realize it, was not the ritual and ceremony they remembered from their own military tradition, but rather something entirely different, something that would prove far more devastating to their sense of superiority than any amount of formal protocol could have been. They would encounter scale, pure and simple, abundance on a level that their agricultural system, even before the war had destroyed so much of it, had never been able to match. But still, in those barracks, as the afternoon heat made the air inside shimmer and sweat ran down their faces and their stomachs cramped with hunger, the prisoners laughed among themselves, their voices carrying a bitter edge of mockery. They imagined being handed dented tin cups filled with watery soup, perhaps receiving a single slice of dry bread, hard and stale, the kind of prison fare that seemed appropriate for defeated enemies. One young private, his face still bearing the softness of youth despite the hardships he had endured, muttered to his neighbour that surely the Americans would make them eat like animals in a barn, perhaps from a single large pot with everyone using the same spoon, without any consideration for dignity or individual worth. Even their hunger, which was real and constant and gnawing, could not manage to silence the smugness that had been bred into them through years of propaganda and indoctrination. They believed, with a conviction that was almost touching in its naivety, that America was too crude a nation, too brash and loud and lacking in refinement, to understand what a proper meal should mean, what it should represent beyond the mere filling of an empty stomach. And so the stage had been set in a way that neither the prisoners nor their American captors fully appreciated at the time. Here were these German soldiers, these men who had fought for a regime that proclaimed itself the pinnacle of European civilization, now reduced to sneering prisoners whose bodies were hollow with hunger, whose uniforms hung from their frames like scarecrows' rags, yet who remained wrapped in a cocoon of arrogance that seemed impervious to reality. They were about to walk through a set of doors that would shake the foundations of their confidence more thoroughly than any battlefield defeat had managed to do, more completely than the surrender of their armies or the occupation of their homeland. For behind those cafeteria doors, beneath the harsh glow of electric lights that burned steadily without the flickering uncertainty of candles or the dim yellow of oil lamps, there waited not the humiliation they had imagined, not the degradation they had prepared themselves to endure, but rather a revelation that would echo through their memories for decades to come, that some of them would carry with them until their dying days, unable to forget the moment when their assumptions about the world were shattered by something as simple and profound as the sight of more food than they had seen in years. That first night in captivity, after they had been processed and assigned to their barracks and given threadbare blankets to spread on their bunks, passed in the usual mixture of physical exhaustion and emotional resentment that characterizes the experience of defeated soldiers suddenly thrust into imprisonment. Some men slept fitfully, their bodies finally relaxing after months of constant tension, while others lay awake staring at the ceiling boards above them, wondering what would become of them, whether they would ever see their homes again, whether those homes even still existed or had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. But when morning came and they stirred from their bunks, rubbing sleep from their eyes and feeling the familiar gnaw of hunger in their bellies, they carried with them still that curious pride, that sense of cultural superiority that was rooted not in any present victory, for they had none, but rather in memory, in the collective recollection of how things had been, or at least how they remembered things having been, before the world fell apart around them. What these men missed most acutely, what haunted their thoughts during quiet moments, was not actually the experience of combat itself, not the camaraderie of the battlefield or the adrenaline rush of engagement with the enemy, but rather the ritual of the German table, the customs and ceremonies that had structured their meals and given them meaning beyond mere nutrition. In their minds, which had a tendency to romanticize the past as minds often do when the present is unbearable, even the simplest military mess hall back in Germany had carried an air of ceremony and significance that elevated it above the mundane. There had been order in every gesture, they remembered, a choreography to the meal that everyone understood and observed. The officers were always seated first, their positions at table corresponding to their rank and authority, while junior men waited their turn, standing at attention until given permission to sit. Before anyone touched their food, there had been the tradition of folding hands in a moment of silence, sometimes a brief prayer, though more often just a pause to acknowledge the meal and express gratitude for it, even when that meal consisted of little more than cabbage and black bread. The serving of food, even when the food itself was poor in quality and meagre in quantity, was done with a measured deliberation, sausages, if there were any, distributed with careful fairness, cabbage spooned out in equal portions, sometimes even a small ration of wine passed around if fortune had favoured them and supplies had come through. They remembered, too, the sensory details that had surrounded these meals, the sharp clatter of boots across floors that had been polished until they gleamed, the smell of pipe tobacco curling through the air as senior officers smoked after finishing their food, the way silence was enforced throughout the room until the ranking officer, having surveyed his subordinates and satisfied himself that all was in order, finally lifted his fork and took the first bite, which served as the signal that everyone else could begin eating. These rituals, these small ceremonies, they told themselves, represented something more than food, something deeper than hunger and its satisfaction. They were an expression of hierarchy, certainly, a visible manifestation of the chain of command that structured military life, but they were also about discipline, about the ability to impose order and structure, even on something as basic and animal as eating. And beyond that, these rituals served as a marker of identity, a way of saying this is who we are, this is what separates us from those who eat like barbarians, without thought or grace or proper understanding. Even in defeat, even as prisoners transported thousands of miles from home to a foreign land whose customs they did not understand, these men clung desperately to the belief that German meals had always been more sophisticated than anything these Americans could conceive of, that their dining traditions reflected a culture superior in every way to the crude and noisy habits they imagined awaited them in this new world. In the barracks during those early days of captivity, the conversation circled endlessly around these themes, returning again and again to the same assertions and assumptions. A captain who had come from Bavaria, a region known for its food and beer and robust traditions, took it upon himself to remind the younger men, those who perhaps did not remember the pre-war days as clearly, that Americans fundamentally misunderstood the very concept of culture, believing that quantity could substitute for quality, that having more of something was better than having the right kind of something. He insisted, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never actually set foot in America and knew it only through distorted second-hand accounts, that Germans, even when their cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied bombers, even when their infrastructure was crumbling and their supply lines were cut and their agricultural production had collapsed, had managed to preserve the dignity of dining. There had been linen cloths on tables, he claimed, whenever it was possible to have them, even if those cloths had been mended and patched. There had been toasts offered to fallen comrades, glasses raised in their memory. There had been rules, protocols, standards of behaviour that made the table an extension of the officer corps itself, a place where military bearing was maintained even during the act of eating. For this captain, and for many who listened to his words and nodded in agreement, food in Germany might have become scarce as the war progressed. Rations might have dwindled to almost nothing in those final terrible months. But paradoxically, this very scarcity had given ritual even more meaning, had made the ceremonies surrounding meals more important rather than less so. To him, and to those who thought as he did, the act of eating was never just about survival, never merely the mechanical process of filling one's stomach to stave off hunger for another few hours. It was instead a performance, a kind of theatre in which pride and identity were expressed and reinforced, where Germanness itself was enacted through the proper observance of table manners and dining etiquette. The younger prisoners, those men barely out of their teens who had been conscripted late in the war and had known little but chaos and retreat, listened to these older men speak and found themselves nodding along, absorbing these lessons about how things had been, or at least how they were supposed to have been. Some of them thought of home as the captain spoke, of mothers who had somehow managed to lay out steaming potatoes on chipped plates even when potatoes were almost impossible to find, who had made something from nothing through sheer determination and resourcefulness. Others thought of fathers who had sliced bread with deliberate care, treating even a small loaf as though it were something precious and valuable, which of course it was in those lean times. These memories, whether they were entirely accurate or had been embellished and improved by the natural tendency of memory to soften hardship and emphasize meaning, carried with them an aura of superiority, an unshakable conviction that Germans had always eaten with more refinement and grace than Americans ever could, that there was something fundamentally more civilized about the German approach to food and dining. The word cafeteria, which the American guards used so casually, still tasted foreign and strange when they tried to pronounce it, the syllables awkward in their mouths, and they used it mockingly when they spoke among themselves, as though describing some kind of carnival booth or a feeding station for livestock, unable to imagine that such a word could describe any place of dignity or worth. They could not begin to conceive, their imaginations limited by their assumptions, that within just a few short hours this pride that they wore like armour, This sense of cultural superiority that had sustained them through defeat and captivity would begin to falter and crack, that the careful rituals they remembered so fondly, the ceremonies that had given meaning to their meals, would suddenly seem small and almost fragile when confronted with something larger, something that operated on an entirely different scale and according to entirely different principles. What these prisoners did not yet understand, what they had no framework for comprehending because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it, was that America's strength, the true source of American power, was not located in ritual or ceremony, not in the careful observance of protocol or the maintenance of hierarchy, but rather in abundance itself, in the sheer overwhelming scale of production and distribution that American industry and agriculture had achieved. The American way was not about hierarchy, but about democracy, not about preserving distinctions between ranks and classes, but about flattening them, about providing enough for everyone regardless of their station. For these German prisoners of war, men who had been raised in a system that emphasized order and rank and the proper place of each person in a rigid social structure, this would prove to be perhaps the cruelest twist of all, the most devastating revelation. The tables they longed for in their memories, those carefully arranged settings with their rituals and their pride and their sense of proper order, would suddenly feel small and cramped, almost pathetically inadequate when confronted with the bright and roaring and fundamentally democratic machine of an American cafeteria, a system designed not to reinforce hierarchy, but to feed masses of people efficiently and abundantly. And so they waited, these prisoners, lined up as instructed by the guards, their stomachs growling with hunger that had become such a constant companion, they barely noticed it anymore, still utterly certain in their convictions, still convinced beyond any doubt that they knew what it meant to dine with dignity and proper form. They remained completely unaware that the next door they would pass through, that simple cafeteria entrance, was not just a passage into a mess hall, but rather a mirror, a reflecting surface that would show them with brutal clarity the true difference between the two worlds they represented, between a system that valued ritual over abundance and one that had mastered the art of production on a scale that made ritual seem almost beside the point. The whistle that signalled midday mealtime blew across the camp compound, its shrill sound cutting through the afternoon heat, and the guards began calling out in their flat American accents for the prisoners to assemble, to form up in lines, to prepare for their first experience of American prison camp dining. Rows upon rows of weary German soldiers shuffled forward, their boots scuffing against the gravel pathways that crisscrossed the camp, the sun overhead glaring down without mercy on men who were accustomed to the gentler light of northern Europe. They followed the line as directed, most of them still expecting some crude arrangement, perhaps a large pot of thin stew from which they would be served with a ladle that would splash watery broth into dented tin cups or bowls, the kind of degrading feeding arrangement that seemed appropriate for defeated enemies, for men who had lost and deserved to be reminded of their loss. Yet, as they turned the corner of one of the larger buildings and came into view of their destination, what awaited them looked nothing at all like the humiliation they had prepared themselves to endure with stoic German pride. The cafeteria doors, wide and painted a clean white, swung open before them, and the prisoners in the front of the line froze in their tracks so suddenly that those behind nearly walked into them, causing a moment of confusion and muttered curses. Before them stretched a hall that blazed with electric light, the brightness almost painful to eyes that had grown accustomed to dimness and shadow. The illumination came from rows of fluorescent bulbs mounted in the ceiling, a type of lighting that was still relatively uncommon in Europe, but which the Americans used with casual abundance, and this harsh white light revealed every detail of the space with pitiless clarity. Rows of tables, their surfaces made of polished metal or laminate that gleamed beneath the lights, stretched away into the distance, their order precise and geometric, their cleanliness almost shocking to men who had lived in filth for months. Each table was spotless, wiped down and sanitized, their surfaces reflecting the light in ways that made them seem almost to glow, and around them stood benches or chairs arranged with military precision, Along one entire side of this enormous hall ran the serving lines, and it was these that truly captured the attention of the stunned prisoners. Stainless steel counters extended for what seemed an impossible distance, their surfaces also polished and gleaming, reflecting upward the heat that rose from great pans and vats of food that sat in warming trays beneath. Steam curled upward from these containers in visible waves, carrying with it smells that made the prisoners' empty stomachs clench with sudden fierce longing. The aroma of beef stew rich with gravy, of mashed potatoes smooth and buttery, of vegetables cooked until tender. Loaves of bread, real bread made from white flour and not the sawdust-adulterated grey substance they had been eating for years, sat stacked in baskets, piled higher than any prisoner had seen since before the war began, before the shortages had started, before rationing had become a fact of daily life. The sight was almost cinematic in its impact, overwhelming in its visual and olfactory assault, as though it had been deliberately staged to shock men who had been living in shadows and deprivation, who had grown accustomed to scarcity as the normal state of existence. Green beans glistened under the lights, their surfaces still moist with butter or oil that caught and reflected the fluorescent glow. Cakes, actual cakes made with real sugar and eggs and flour, were arranged in neat rows on separate tables, their frosting smooth and perfect. Some chocolate and some vanilla, a luxury so extreme that several prisoners actually rubbed their eyes, wondering if they were experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by hunger and fatigue. Pitchers of milk, cold and white and fresh, stood ready on the counters alongside large urns of coffee that sent up their own fragrant steam, both beverages simply waiting to be poured, available in quantities that seemed to deny the very existence of shortage or want. The air itself inside this hall carried a warmth that came not from the weather outside but from the food, from the roasted meat and baked goods and hot vegetables, and this warmth enveloped the prisoners as they stood frozen in the doorway, unable quite to process what they were seeing, their minds struggling to reconcile this abundance with their expectations of prison camp life. For a long moment, silence fell among the men at the front of the line, their arrogance and their mockery and their smug certainty faltering under the sheer sensory force of abundance that confronted them. A young corporal, his face still bearing the scars of some earlier wound, whispered in a voice barely audible, "This, all of this is for prisoners, for us." The question in his voice betrayed his confusion, his inability to understand why defeated enemies would be fed like this. Another soldier, who could not have been more than 20 years old despite the premature aging that hunger and hardship had imposed on his features, blinked rapidly, his eyes moving from the bread to the meat to the cakes and back again, as though fearing that this vision might vanish like a mirage if he looked away for even a moment. Their eyes darted nervously to the American guards who stood nearby, half expecting to hear laughter or to be told this was some kind of cruel joke, that this bounty was not for them, but for someone else. But the Americans simply gestured toward the stacks of metal trays with an impatient, businesslike manner, as though this mountain of food was nothing remarkable at all, just an ordinary everyday occurrence that required no special comment or explanation. The contrast could not have been more devastating, the psychological impact more complete. Only a few months earlier, perhaps as recently as March or April of that same year, some of these same men had stood in ration lines in cities like Berlin or Hamburg or Cologne, waiting for hours in the cold for their turn to receive a scrap of bread or a ladle of turnip soup, those watery concoctions that barely deserved the name of food. They had watched women and children fight over potato peelings, had seen people collapse from hunger in the streets, had grown accustomed to the sight of emaciated bodies and hollow cheeks and eyes that held the dull glaze of prolonged malnutrition. Now, standing here in captivity thousands of miles from home, they faced more food in a single glance than they had seen in weeks, perhaps months. The polished trays that the guards were handing out reflected not just the steam rising from the serving pans, but something larger, an image of America itself that these prisoners had not been prepared to see. Here was industrial might translated directly into sustenance, power measured not in tanks or bombs, but in calories and cups of milk, in pounds of bread and gallons of stew, in the sheer overwhelming capacity to feed not just one's own people, but even one's enemies. Behind the group at the doorway, a Luftwaffe sergeant who had flown combat missions over England and had seen his share of terrifying sights in the air, clenched his jaw tight, unwilling to let the men under his command see any trace of awe or astonishment in his face, determined to maintain the bearing and dignity expected of someone of his rank. But even he, despite his best efforts, felt his composure falter as the line began to move forward, and the sharp clatter of steel trays being stacked and distributed rang through the air like some kind of mechanical music. For in that moment, standing on the threshold of this gleaming hall of abundance, the proud rituals of German dining that he and his comrades had discussed so confidently just hours before, those carefully remembered ceremonies involving sausages and wine, toasts and enforced silence and hierarchical seating arrangements, seemed almost quaint in comparison, fragile and small against the scale of this glowing hall that stretched before them. The men were standing on the edge of something more profound than mere hunger and its satisfaction. They were standing before a revelation about power and its sources, about what it meant to win and to lose, and as they stepped across the threshold, as the first prisoners reached out to take hold of a shining American tray from the stack being offered by a bored-looking guard, they began to realize with a sick feeling in their stomachs that what they had mocked only hours before, what they had laughed at and dismissed as crude American barbarism, was about to strip away the very pride they had carried with them across the ocean, the last possession that defeat had not yet taken from them. The line shuffled forward with agonizing slowness, each step echoing against the spotless tile floor that had been mopped and polished until it too seemed to gleam under the relentless illumination. The guards, looking almost bored with the routine they had performed countless times before, handed out trays to each prisoner as they passed, these trays constructed of cold steel that felt substantial and real in hands that trembled slightly from hunger and nervous anticipation. The guards pointed toward the serving counters with casual gestures, their body language suggesting this was all perfectly normal, nothing unusual or special about any of it. What happened next, what unfolded before the eyes of these German prisoners over the course of the following minutes, would bewilder them more completely than any weapon they had faced on the battlefield, would prove more disorienting than artillery barrages or tank assaults or any of the violent chaos that characterized modern warfare. There was no single large pot into which food was carelessly dumped without regard for individual dignity or preference. There was no officer barking orders about who would eat and how much they would receive and in what order they would be served. Instead, what the prisoners witnessed was an orderly flow, a system that operated with mechanical efficiency yet somehow maintained a respect for individual choice that they had not anticipated. Each man walked forward, sliding his tray along a metal rail that guided it smoothly past the various stations, and at each station he encountered a choice, a decision to be made. A spoonful of mashed potatoes, thick and steaming, or perhaps he would prefer to skip the potatoes and save room for something else. Beef stew ladled generously into a section of the divided tray, or chicken if he preferred poultry to red meat. A slice of bread, and then the option of butter or jam, or both if he wished. The rhythm was mechanical in its precision, like a factory assembly line, yet strangely democratic in its implications, a production line of nourishment where each individual man became in effect his own master, making decisions about his meal that no one questioned or challenged. One prisoner, his voice barely above a whisper, muttered in German to the man beside him, "We are permitted to choose," as though the very concept required confirmation, as though he could not quite believe what he was experiencing. The guard who overheard him, though understanding no German, simply nodded in that vague way people do when they sense a question has been asked but don't know its content, a gesture that only confirmed what the prisoner had hesitantly suggested. Another man, a corporal who had not seen his home in Bavaria for 3 years, leaned close to his companion and whispered with wonder in his voice, Like the American soldiers themselves, we eat like them. And this observation, this realization that prisoners were being fed in essentially the same manner as their captors, struck harder than the smell of the roasted meat or the sight of the cakes. The idea that choice, which these men had always understood as a privilege reserved for those in authority, was being extended even to defeated prisoners, struck them with a force that was almost physical in its impact. In the Wehrmacht, throughout their entire military service, rations had been handed down without any consultation or consideration of individual preference. You ate what you were given, without question, without comment, without any opportunity to express preference or desire. The food appeared before you, and you consumed it, grateful for whatever sustenance it provided. Here, in this place of captivity thousands of miles from home, they were being confronted with the freedom to make decisions, to choose cornbread or biscuits, carrots or green beans, coffee or milk, to exercise agency over something as fundamental as what they would put in their mouths and swallow. Some prisoners hesitated at the counters, their hands hovering uncertainly over the serving implements, as though reaching for too much food might expose some kind of trap, might trigger punishment, or reveal that this was all an elaborate test designed to identify those who lacked discipline or self-control. A few glanced back nervously toward their comrades who were still waiting in line, seeking some kind of guidance or permission through eye contact, unsure whether they were truly free to take what they wanted. But as the line continued to move, as more and more men passed through the serving stations and their trays filled with portions that would have seemed generous even before the war, hesitation gradually gave way to a kind of wonder mixed with growing confusion about what all of this meant. Some reached tentatively for gravy, pouring it over their potatoes and meat, watching the thick brown liquid spread across their trays like a blessing. Others took extra bread, stacking slices beside the main portions, unable to resist the temptation of something they had craved for so long. The irony of their situation was brutal in its clarity, sharp as a knife blade. Back home, in the cities and towns they had left behind, families they loved were surviving on meagre rations that seemed to shrink with each passing week. In Hamburg and Cologne and Dresden and Munich, mothers were dividing single slices of bread among multiple children, measuring out spoonfuls of flour as though it were gold dust. Young people were learning what it meant to go to bed hungry, to wake up hungry, to move through entire days with stomachs that cramped and growled in protest. Yet here, on the other side of the world, the defeated enemy, men who had fought against everything America represented, could select between multiple options, could exercise choice in a way that had become impossible for civilians back home. The cafeteria embodied something these prisoners had not been prepared for intellectually or emotionally, a demonstration of abundance linked inextricably with liberty, with freedom of choice. Each tray became in effect a silent lecture, a wordless lesson about the nature of power and the character of American society. It was democracy translated directly into food, a weapon that required no gunpowder, yet proved no less devastating in its effects than artillery or bombs. As they finished moving through the line and turned to find seats at the long tables, forks and knives clattering against the metal trays with sounds that echoed through the hall, the prisoners glanced at one another with expressions that mingled uneasiness with something approaching disbelief. Pride and confusion tangled in their throats, making it difficult to swallow even as their bodies screamed for the nutrition so close at hand. One man, his tray balanced carefully in both hands, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered in a voice that shook slightly. We truly believed they would humiliate us, that they would treat us like animals. But what is this abundance, this choice? What is this if not a humiliation of a different and perhaps deeper kind, a demonstration that our assumptions were wrong from the very beginning? For the first time since they had arrived at the camp, the laughter that had filled the barracks when they first heard about the cafeteria was nowhere to be heard. In its place settled the quiet confusion of men who were being forced to see freedom and power, not in the speeches or propaganda banners they had been trained to recognize. But in something as simple and profound as the steaming haze rising from their own plates, in the democratic abundance of an American prison camp cafeteria that fed even its enemies better than the fatherland had fed its own people in the final desperate years of the war. The first bites of actual food, after so many months of near starvation, silenced the hall in a way that orders never could have achieved. Forks scraped gently against metal trays as men lifted food to their mouths, some moving slowly and deliberately as though each bite required conscious thought and careful consideration, others eating with barely controlled urgency that spoke to the depth of their hunger. A private who had grown up in the city of Bremen, who had not tasted real meat since the winter of 1944 when supplies to his unit had dwindled to almost nothing, closed his eyes as the beef stew coated his tongue, the rich flavours of meat and gravy and vegetables exploding across taste buds that had almost forgotten such sensations existed. Nearby, another prisoner who had initially been sceptical of the pale spread that the Americans called peanut butter, having never encountered such a substance before in his life, dipped a corner of his bread into it experimentally, grimaced at the unfamiliar texture and taste, but then found himself reaching for more despite his initial reaction. The salt and sweetness and richness, unlike anything in his culinary experience, yet undeniably satisfying to his starved body. The initial sneers and mockery that had characterized their conversation about American food dissolved into hurried chewing, into the mechanical motion of fork to mouth, chew and swallow, fork to mouth again. Eyes darted around the tables, each man watching his comrades to see who would be the first to admit what they were all feeling, who would be brave enough or honest enough to acknowledge that this food, despite coming from a source they had been taught to despise, was good, was plentiful, was more than they had dared to hope for. Within minutes of sitting down, the careful order of the serving line began to break down in a way that none of the prisoners had anticipated. Men who had finished their first portions, their trays scraped clean with bread used to soak up every last drop of gravy, rose awkwardly from their seats, trays still clutched in their hands, and drifted back toward the serving counters with expressions that mixed shame with need. They had mocked the very concept of American cafeterias, had laughed at the idea of American food, had insisted on their cultural superiority, and now here they were, unable to resist the temptation of going back for more, of taking advantage of the abundance that had been offered to them. The American guards looked on with expressions of faint amusement, some of them exchanging knowing glances, having seen this scene play out before with other groups of prisoners, understanding without words the complex emotions that were churning beneath the surface. The same Germans who had laughed at American cafeterias just hours before, who had sneered at the very word as though it represented everything crude and uncivilized about American culture, now returned for second helpings with heads slightly bowed, their pride wounded, but their hunger stronger than their dignity. One Luftwaffe officer, a man who had held rank and commanded respect from subordinates, muttered to his comrade in a voice meant to be private but loud enough to be overheard by several others nearby. In Germany right now, at this very moment, even civilians are starving, people we knew, families we loved, they have nothing. Yet here, in this place where we are prisoners, where we are the defeated enemy, even we who are captives eat our fill, and more besides. His words spread quietly through the tables, repeated in whispers and murmurs, passing from man to man like a confession of something they had all realized but had not yet articulated, the terrible irony that their captivity was providing them with better nutrition than freedom had offered in the final months of the war. The atmosphere in the cafeteria shifted perceptibly as the meal progressed. What had begun as shock, that first overwhelming impact of seeing so much food arrayed before them, transformed into something more complex during the actual eating. The second helping became for many of them a kind of surrender, not of their bodies which had already surrendered when they laid down their weapons, but of their pride, of that sense of cultural superiority that had sustained them through defeat. A sergeant who had once lectured younger men at length about the refinement of German dining customs, about the proper way to conduct oneself at table, about the dignity and ceremony that should surround every meal, now found himself shoveling cornbread into his mouth with an eagerness that would have shamed him under other circumstances, eating with the urgency of a boy who fears his plate might be taken away before he finishes. A young private, his fingers sticky with frosting from a piece of cake that tasted sweeter and richer than anything his mother had been able to bake even before the war when ingredients were still available, whispered to the man next to him that this single dessert contained more sugar than his entire family had received in their rations for a full month. In the barracks later that night, after they had been marched back and dismissed to their bunks, after they had lain down on the thin mattresses that were nevertheless more comfortable than many places they had slept during the war, men talked in low voices about what they had experienced, their conversation taking on a different tone than it had before the meal. Some laughed nervously, not at the Americans this time, but at themselves, at how quickly their hunger had defeated their arrogance, at how thoroughly their assumptions had been proven wrong. Yet even now, even after experiencing firsthand the abundance of the American food system, some attempted to explain it away, to fit it into their existing worldview rather than allowing it to challenge that worldview. Gossip festered in corners of the barracks as certain men muttered that the abundance must be some kind of trick, that the Americans had staged this display of bounty specifically to weaken German resolve, to make them question their loyalty to the fatherland. Others claimed that the United States must be wasting food on a criminal scale while Europe bled and starved, and that such waste was proof not of strength but of decadence, of a society that had lost touch with the value of things, that treated resources carelessly because it had never known true scarcity. But for most of the prisoners, regardless of what explanations they offered aloud to save face or maintain pride, the memory of that first cafeteria meal would not fade easily, would not be dismissed or explained away with comfortable rationalizations. It filled not just their stomachs, providing the calories and nutrients their bodies desperately needed, but their imagination as well, challenging them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about America and its capabilities. The experience had planted seeds of doubt about the ideology they had served, about the assumptions they had carried with them since childhood, about the nature of power and civilization and cultural superiority. What they did not know, what they could not have known because the information was not available to them in any form they could access, was that the abundance they had witnessed was not an isolated incident, not a special display arranged for their benefit or to impress them, but rather the standard output of an agricultural and industrial system that had reached a scale unprecedented in human history. In the year 1945 alone, American farms were producing quantities of food that would have seemed impossible to contemplate even a decade earlier. More than 55 billion quarts of milk flowed from dairy cows across the country, processed in facilities that operated with factory-like efficiency, bottled and distributed through supply chains that stretched from coast to coast. Sugar beet fields stretched across the Midwest like white oceans, covering hundreds of thousands of acres, their harvest processed in mills that ran day and night during the season. The cafeteria they had walked through, that gleaming hall of abundance that had so shocked their expectations, was not a performance staged for their benefit, not theatre designed to impress or intimidate, but simply the byproduct of a system that had learned to produce food on an industrial scale, that had integrated farming and processing and distribution into a machine of almost incomprehensible productivity. To the prisoners, experiencing this abundance for the first time, every slice of cake and every glass of milk served as proof of something they were only beginning to understand, that the war had been lost long before they themselves had surrendered, that the defeat had been inevitable from the moment the industrial capacity of the United States had been fully mobilized against them. That night, lying in their bunks while darkness settled over the camp and guards walked their rounds outside, men argued in whispers about fundamental questions they had never thought to ask before. Was America strong primarily because of its weapons and its soldiers, or was the true source of American power located in something more basic, in its ability to feed not just its own population, but armies across 3 continents and hundreds of thousands of prisoners besides? Could an empire built on abundance, on the democratic distribution of plenty, truly be defeated by one that glorified discipline and hierarchy and the careful rationing of scarcity. A captain stared at the ceiling boards above his bunk in silence, unable to answer these questions, unwilling to follow their logical conclusions to the end, yet unable also to simply dismiss them and return to the comfortable certainties he had once held. The taste of that first cafeteria meal lingered in his mouth and in his memory, refusing to be forgotten or minimized, a physical reminder that his assumptions about the world might have been fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. By the second week of their captivity, the cafeteria had become part of the daily routine, as familiar as morning roll call or evening curfew, yet the shock of abundance had not faded despite its repetition. Each day the prisoners filed through those doors, their trays clattering in a rhythm that had become almost musical, steam rising from serving pans in clouds that caught the harsh fluorescent light, choices unfolding before them like a quiet parade of plenty that never seemed to diminish no matter how many men passed through the line. The arrogance that had once wrapped their shoulders like a military cloak, that had sustained them through the initial days of captivity and helped them maintain their dignity in defeat, had thinned gradually, thread by thread pulled loose by each meal, until even the proudest among them, the most stubbornly convinced of German superiority, found themselves standing quietly in line with expressions that betrayed their uncertainty and confusion. One Luftwaffe captain, a man known throughout his unit for his clipped manner of speech and his disdainful gaze that could wither a subordinate with a single glance, was spotted by several of his former subordinates slipping back into line for seconds, his movements almost furtive as though he hoped no one would notice. His men watched in silence, exchanging glances but making no comment, a mixture of relief and discomfort settling in their eyes as they witnessed this visible demonstration that even the highest ranking among them was not immune to hunger, was not above the basic human need for sustenance that transcended pride or ideology. Another officer, one who had lectured the barracks at length during those early days about American vulgarity and the crudeness of American culture, about how refined people ate with ceremony and restraint rather than with the casual efficiency of factory workers, now found himself holding his tray close against his chest, carefully balancing 2 slices of pie as he navigated back to his seat, unable to choose between apple and cherry, and so taking both. Nobody mocked him for this display of appetite. Nobody made jokes at his expense. Hunger had united them more effectively than rank or ideology or national identity ever had, reducing them all to the same basic condition of need and its satisfaction. But there was another dimension to the cafeteria experience that unsettled many of the prisoners even more deeply than the abundance itself, another aspect of daily meals that challenged their worldview in ways they struggled to articulate or process. Behind the serving counters, working with quiet efficiency to keep the pans filled and the line moving, stood not just white American cooks and mess workers, which would have been expected and unremarkable, but also African American soldiers in uniform, and sometimes women, actual female military personnel serving food to prisoners of war with a matter-of-fact efficiency that suggested they saw nothing unusual or remarkable in the situation. For men who had been fed propaganda about racial hierarchy for years, who had been taught as fundamental truth that some races were superior to others, who had absorbed these ideas until they seemed as natural and obvious as the sky being blue. The moment when food was handed to them respectfully, silently, without any suggestion of civility or inferiority, by someone whom their ideology had taught them to view as racially inferior, shook them more deeply than they could comfortably admit aloud. Whispers spread through the barracks that night, conversations carried on in hushed voices after the lights had been turned out and the guards had moved away from their immediate vicinity. Some men muttered about shame, though they struggled to explain exactly what they were ashamed of or why they felt this emotion so strongly. Others deflected, claiming that this integration of races in military service was just America's way, a peculiarity of American culture that meant nothing in the larger scheme of things, certainly nothing that required them to question the racial theories they had been taught since childhood. But the silence of the officers, men who might have been expected to provide guidance and interpretation of these experiences, told its own story more eloquently than words could have. The cafeteria was revealing itself to be not only a place of physical abundance, a hall where hungry men could fill their stomachs until satisfied, but also a daily reminder, repeated with each meal, that the world they had believed in, that carefully ordered universe where hierarchy and ritual and racial superiority provided structure and meaning, was collapsing around them with every spoonful of stew, with every cup of milk poured by hands they had been taught to despise. Statistics, when the prisoners eventually learned them or pieced them together from comments made by guards or from old newspapers that sometimes found their way into the barracks, sharpened the sense of humiliation rather than diminishing it. Each camp cafeteria, they discovered, could serve thousands of meals within a single hour, the whole operation running with the precision of a factory assembly line, conveyor belt efficiency, matched with industrial might on a scale that made their own military supply systems seem primitive by comparison. At places like Camp Swift in Texas, which held thousands of German prisoners, records showed that over 20,000 pounds of flour were transformed into bread each week, this single statistic representing an output that exceeded the production of entire regions in wartime Germany. The numbers were staggering in their implications, relentless in their accumulation, undeniable in what they revealed about the relative capabilities of the two nations that had been at war. Where Germany had struggled to feed its own children in the final years of the conflict, where mothers had watched their babies grow thin and weak from malnutrition, America was feeding its prisoners of war as though scarcity simply did not exist as a concept, as though the very idea of shortage was foreign to American thinking. As the trays clattered through the serving lines day after day, as the familiar rhythm of the cafeteria became woven into the fabric of daily life in the camp, many prisoners found themselves lost in thought during meals, their minds working over questions they had never expected to confront. What did it mean, they wondered, to be fed so well by an enemy who by all rights could have starved them or provided only the minimum necessary to sustain life? Was this abundance an expression of kindness, of some inherent American generosity or humanitarian impulse, or was it instead a form of domination dressed up as mercy, a demonstration of power that was somehow more devastating than any punishment could have been? A young corporal, one of the few prisoners who had managed to keep a small diary hidden from the guards, admitted in his private writings that he had come to fear the food more than he feared the barbed wire that surrounded the camp or the armed guards who watched over them. The food, he wrote in cramped handwriting, made him forget his hatred, made it difficult to maintain the clear sense of enemy and friend, made everything confused and uncertain in ways that troubled him deeply. Each meal weakened his grip on the beliefs he had once held with absolute conviction, spoonful by spoonful eroding the foundation of his world-view until he no longer knew what he believed or why. As autumn arrived and sunlight began to slant across the camp at different angles, taking on that golden quality characteristic of the season, the cafeteria doors continued to open at regular intervals, admitting prisoners who had by now grown accustomed to the ritual even as its deeper meaning continued to unsettle them. The familiar elements repeated themselves with each meal, the shuffle of boots across clean floors, the gleam of metal trays reflecting overhead lights, the rising steam of food in warming pans. Yet something fundamental had shifted in how the prisoners experienced and understood these daily gatherings. What had begun months earlier as laughter and mockery had transformed first into awe, then into uneasy acceptance, and now lingered as memory in the process of being etched into the very core of their being, becoming part of how they understood themselves and their place in the world. These were men who had once sworn allegiance to a regime that proclaimed itself the peak of civilization, and now they were being forced to reconsider everything that allegiance had meant. A grey-haired officer, his face lined with years and experiences that had aged him beyond his actual years, a veteran of campaigns on the Eastern Front where he had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life, sat quietly one afternoon at a corner table in the cafeteria, somewhat apart from the other prisoners. He held his tray before him as though it were some kind of religious relic, something deserving of contemplation and careful consideration rather than just rapid consumption. On that tray lay mashed potatoes, still steaming slightly, their surface smooth and inviting, green beans that glistened with butter under the lights, and a slice of chocolate cake whose richness seemed almost obscene in its indulgence. He ate slowly, with an almost ceremonial deliberateness, as though each bite carried the weight of lessons learned and illusions shattered, each forkful representing another acknowledgement that the world was not what he had been taught to believe it was. Later that evening, after the prisoners had been marched back to their barracks and the day's activities had wound down towards sleep, this same officer whispered to a comrade in the bunk next to his, speaking so quietly that his words were barely audible above the background noise of men settling in for the night. "They win," he said, "not only with guns and tanks and aircraft, not only with the weapons we could see and understand and respect as instruments of warfare, but with their ability to feed everyone, even us, even their defeated enemies, even prisoners who by all traditional logic should be given only enough to survive and nothing more." "We were wrong," he continued after a pause, his voice carrying a kind of exhausted acceptance. "We were wrong to laugh at them, wrong to assume that culture and refinement could be measured by ritual and ceremony, wrong to think that our way of doing things was inherently superior." The cafeteria, he concluded, had become for him a symbol of something he was only beginning to understand, a demonstration that power in the modern world flowed not from tradition or hierarchy or careful observance of protocol, but from the raw ability to produce and distribute resources on a scale that made such concerns seem almost quaint. The cafeteria had indeed become symbolic, had transformed from a simple functional space for feeding prisoners into a kind of theatre where abundance was performed daily, where each meal served as a demonstration of American industrial and agricultural capacity. Its mechanical nature, the way steel trays slid along rails without human intervention, the way milk jugs clinked as they were filled and refilled throughout the service period, the way loaves of bread were stacked in baskets that seemed to never empty no matter how many hands reached for them. All of this testified to something larger than mere food preparation or military logistics. It represented industrial democracy in motion, a machine built not primarily to fight, though it could certainly do that with devastating effectiveness, but rather fundamentally designed to nourish, to provide sustenance on a mass scale with an efficiency that approached the miraculous. For the German prisoners, who came from a tradition that valued craftsmanship and individual skill, who had been raised to believe that quality was more important than quantity, it became impossible to ignore that such power, such overwhelming productive capacity, made their once proud rituals of wine and sausage and proper table manners feel like echoes from another century, like customs preserved in amber from a time that had passed and would not return. Stories from the camps began to spread beyond the barbed wire fences through various channels, through letters that prisoners were eventually allowed to write home, though these were carefully censored, through whispered conversations with new arrivals who brought news from other camps, through the grapevine of information that exists in any military or institutional setting. Some prisoners, when given the opportunity to write to family members still in Germany, crafted their messages carefully, aware that anything they wrote would be read by censors, but wanting nevertheless to communicate something of their experience. They hinted, with deliberate vagueness that might pass inspection, that captivity was proving less brutal than they had feared, that the Americans were providing adequate food and shelter, that conditions were not what propaganda had led them to expect. Others remained completely silent on the subject, finding themselves unable to put into words what they were experiencing, ashamed in some fundamental way that their most vivid and haunting memory of war was turning out to be not the sound of gunfire or the chaos of battle, but rather the overwhelming abundance of an enemy cafeteria, the sight of more food than they had seen in years arranged before them with casual American efficiency. The irony of their situation cut deep into their sense of self and identity, sharper than any blade. The regime they had served, that government they had sworn oaths to and fought for across multiple theatres of war, had promised them supremacy over other peoples, had assured them that German discipline and German organization and German culture made them superior to the mongrel democracies of the West. But the lesson they were learning through daily experience, the truth that was being driven home with each meal in the cafeteria, was a lesson of humiliation delivered not through violence or degradation, but through second helpings, through the ability to choose between cornbread and biscuits, through glasses of cold milk and slices of cake that seemed to deny the very existence of scarcity. Their proud fatherland, which had mobilized every resource for total war, which had demanded absolute sacrifice from its people, had nevertheless been unable to provide basic nutrition to its children, while their captors fed even prisoners with a carelessness that suggested food was so abundant as to be almost worthless. Years would pass before most of these men saw their homes again, years during which the war's end would be followed by occupation and reconstruction and the slow, painful process of coming to terms with what had been done in Germany's name. But even decades later, long after the war had become history rather than memory, after the camps had been dismantled and the prisoners had returned to civilian life and Germany itself had risen from ruins to rebuild itself as a different kind of nation, these memories of the cafeteria would resurface in unexpected moments. Old men, grandfathers now with their own histories of family and work and ordinary life accumulated over the years, would find themselves speaking less often of actual battlefields and combat experiences, those violent moments that might be expected to dominate a soldier's memories, and more about meals eaten in captivity. A former soldier, sitting with his grandson perhaps, trying to explain what the war had been like, would find himself describing not the thunder of artillery or the fear of combat, but rather the day when he had mocked the concept of an American cafeteria, had laughed at the very idea that such a thing could possess any dignity or worth, and then had stood in line for second helpings, his pride dissolving before the simple fact of abundance. His voice would tremble as he described details that had burned themselves into memory, the clatter of metal trays sliding along steel rails, the flood of milk from large pitchers that seemed bottomless, the unexpected sweetness of American cornbread with its golden colour and moist, crumbly texture, unlike any bread he had known before, the way butter melted into it when spread while still warm from the oven. These images, more than the sharp crack of rifles being fired in anger, more than the rumble of tanks or the scream of incoming shells, had revealed to him with devastating clarity the true scale of American power, had shown him that victory in modern war went not necessarily to the most disciplined or the most ideologically committed, but to those who could sustain their effort through sheer productive capacity, through the unglamorous but essential work of feeding armies and populations across vast distances for years on end. And so this story, this account of German prisoners who encountered American abundance in the most unlikely of settings, draws toward its close not with the dramatic thunder of warfare or the explosive fire of battle, but rather with a quiet and lingering image that captures something essential about power and its nature in the modern world. Picture, if you will, a shining steel tray, its surface polished to reflect the light, piled high with food that steams gently in the cool air of an afternoon, sitting beneath the hard, unwavering glow of electric lights that banish all shadow and illuminate every detail with brutal honesty. For the prisoners who had once scoffed at the very concept of American dining, who had dismissed cafeterias as barbaric feeding stations unworthy of civilized people, who had clung to memories of German table ritual as proof of their cultural superiority, this tray and everything it represented became a weapon more powerful than any cannon that had ever been forged, more devastating in its psychological impact than bombs or bullets could ever be. It was a lesson delivered not through violence, but through plenty, an education administered not with cruelty, but with an almost casual generosity that made it all the more difficult to dismiss or rationalize away. The abundance itself, the sheer overwhelming quantity of food available even to defeated enemies, broke down the walls of pride and ideological certainty more surely and completely than any artillery bombardment could have accomplished, because it challenged not their bodies, but their fundamental understanding of how the world worked and who held power within it. History, as we reflect on these events from the distance of many decades, often teaches its lessons through noise and violence, through the spectacular and dramatic moments that capture imagination and demand attention. We remember the roar of cannons firing in unison, the thunder of thousands of aircraft engines filling the sky, the shouts of armies advancing across fields of battle, the explosive destruction of cities reduced to rubble by strategic bombing campaigns. These are the images that dominate our collective memory of warfare, the scenes that appear in documentaries and fill the pages of history books, and certainly they represent important truths about the nature of conflict and the terrible cost of war. Yet sometimes, perhaps more often than we recognize or acknowledge, history's deepest and most profound lessons come not through such noise and fury, but rather quietly, almost subtly, in moments that might seem mundane or ordinary if examined superficially. The clatter of trays being stacked and distributed in a mess hall, the steam rising from pans of food kept warm for serving, the simple everyday ritual of standing in line to receive a meal. These unremarkable actions can carry meaning that resonates across decades and shapes understanding in ways that spectacle cannot match. The story of these German prisoners, men who had once gathered in their barracks to mock the very concept of American cafeterias with confident laughter and sneering superiority, only to find themselves standing humbly in line for second helpings just hours later, their certainty shattered and their pride wounded by nothing more threatening than abundance, reminds us that power manifests itself in many forms beyond the purely military. Sometimes the most devastating demonstration of strength is not expressed through violence or destruction, not through the capacity to kill and destroy, but rather through the ability to nourish and sustain, to provide for basic human needs without apparent effort or strain. The simple act of offering food in quantities that seem to deny the very existence of scarcity, of creating systems capable of feeding millions without breaking down or failing. This too is a form of power, perhaps in some ways more fundamental and more impressive than the ability to build weapons or win battles, because it speaks to the underlying productive capacity of a society rather than merely its destructive potential. For the men who lived through this experience, who passed from the confidence of assumed superiority through the shock of encountering abundance to the long, slow process of adjusting their worldview to accommodate uncomfortable truths, the cafeteria became a memory that remained sharper and more vivid than many battlefield experiences, a recollection that retained its emotional power long after other wartime memories had faded to vague impressions. It stripped away the protective layers of pride and ideology that had insulated them from certain realities, peeling back their assumptions like layers of an onion until they were forced to confront truths they had been carefully taught to ignore or deny. The regime that had commanded their loyalty and their service, that government which had promised to lead Germany to supremacy over other nations through discipline and will and proper understanding of racial hierarchy, had ultimately proven unable to accomplish the most basic task of any government, which is to feed its own people adequately and consistently. It could not fill the stomachs of German children, while American camps were filling the stomachs even of German prisoners. And this simple fact, this brutal comparison between promise and reality, undermined ideological certainty more effectively than any amount of argument or propaganda could have done. America, with its vast agricultural plains that stretched to horizons beyond imagining, with its factories that never seemed to rest, with its supply chains that moved resources across continental distances with mechanical efficiency, had offered these prisoners something their homeland in its final desperate years could not provide, no matter how much it demanded sacrifice from its citizens. The Americans had given them a vision of plenty so vast and so casually administered that it extended even to enemies, even to men who had fought against everything America represented, even to defeated soldiers who by all traditional logic should have been given only the bare minimum necessary to sustain life. This generosity, if that is the right word for it, or perhaps this demonstration of surplus capacity might be more accurate, challenged everything these prisoners had been taught about strength and weakness, about civilization and barbarism, about which societies were truly advanced and which were primitive underneath their pretensions. In later years, in the decades that followed the war when Germany had been divided and then eventually reunited, When the occupation had ended and sovereignty had been restored, when the economic miracle of reconstruction had transformed the landscape and created prosperity that would have seemed impossible amid the ruins of 1945, many of these former prisoners found themselves carrying a paradox within them that they struggled to articulate or fully understand. They had been defeated in war, crushed by superior force and compelled to surrender, their nation occupied and their ideology discredited. Yet during that defeat they had been fed in a manner that millions of free Germans had not experienced during the final years of conflict. They had stood in line expecting humiliation, expecting to be treated as defeated enemies, deserved to be treated according to the harsh logic of total war, expecting the minimum rations that would keep them alive to perform whatever labor their captors required. And instead they had encountered the strange democracy of an American cafeteria where even prisoners could choose between options and take second helpings if they wished. They had laughed in those early days at the thought of eating like children. They had used that very phrase, dismissing American dining as crude and unsophisticated, lacking the ritual and ceremony that marked truly civilized behavior. Yet in the end, they had found a different kind of dignity in the simple ability to choose their own meals, to exercise agency over what went onto their trays, to be treated as individuals capable of making decisions rather than as a mass to be processed and controlled. And in the stillness that comes with old age, when the memories of active life blur and fade, when the sharp edges of experience soften into general impressions, when one's own history becomes something to be examined and questioned rather than simply lived. It was not always the dramatic moments of warfare that these men found themselves remembering with greatest clarity, not the battles that had seemed so important at the time or the grand movements of armies across maps, but rather the cafeteria, that brightly lit hall where abundance had been served with casual American efficiency. One such old soldier, his hair white and his hands spotted with age, sitting perhaps in a comfortable chair in a house his children had bought for him, once remarked to a visitor that he could still hear, even so many years after the war had ended, even after he had lived an entire lifetime of peace and normal civilian experience, the distinctive sound of metal trays sliding along steel rails in an American prison camp cafeteria. The sound had lodged itself in his memory with the permanence of trauma. Though it was not a traumatic sound in any conventional sense, carried no association with violence or pain or fear for his life. It was simply the echo of a truth that he had learned in that place, a lesson that had been taught not through words or lectures, but through the direct physical experience of abundance. The undeniable reality that strength in the modern world is measured not only by military capability or ideological fervour, but also, perhaps even primarily, by the quiet and relentless power of a society that has mastered the unglamorous work of production and distribution, that can feed even its enemies without apparent strain or difficulty. To him, that sound of sliding trays represented the moment when his certainties had begun to crumble, when the world he thought he understood had revealed itself to be something different and more complex than he had been prepared to accept. The experience had taught him something about the nature of power that no amount of military training or ideological education had conveyed, something about how modern industrial societies function and what makes them strong or weak in ways that transcend simple measurements of military hardware or battlefield tactics. He had learned, though the learning had been painful and had taken years to fully process and understand, that a nation's true strength lies not in how well it can starve its enemies, but in how abundantly it can feed everyone, not in how effectively it can impose hierarchy and control, but in how successfully it can create systems that provide for basic human needs with democratic efficiency, treating each person as an individual deserving of choice and agency, rather than as a unit to be managed and directed from above. The cafeteria, in its simple functional design, in its bright lights and steel counters and endless supplies of food, had embodied principles that contradicted everything he had been taught about how societies should be organized and what makes them great, and the fact that it worked, that it actually functioned exactly as promised day after day without failing or breaking down, had forced him to reconsider assumptions he had held since childhood about the superiority of the German way of doing things. As we reach the end of this account, As the narrative draws to its conclusion and we prepare to step back from these individual stories to consider their larger significance, it seems important to pause and reflect on what this experience meant not just for the prisoners themselves, but for our understanding of history and power and the many ways that wars are won and lost. The conventional narrative of the Second World War, the story most commonly told and most widely accepted, focuses on military campaigns and strategic decisions, on the movement of armies and the outcomes of battles, on the development of new weapons and the tactical innovations that shaped combat across multiple theatres. These elements are certainly important and deserve the attention they receive, but they tell only part of the story, perhaps not even the most important part, when we consider what ultimately determined the war's outcome and why one side prevailed while the other was crushed despite its early advantages and its soldiers' often fanatical commitment to their cause. What the cafeteria experience reveals, what it demonstrates with uncomfortable clarity for anyone willing to look past surface appearances and consider deeper meanings, is that industrial capacity and logistical capability matter at least as much as battlefield courage or tactical brilliance, that the ability to sustain an effort over years of grinding conflict depends fundamentally on unglamorous factors like agricultural production and transportation networks and supply chain management, rather than on inspiring speeches or ideological fervour. The German army had produced excellent soldiers, men who fought with skill and determination under terrible conditions, who maintained discipline even in defeat, who performed remarkable feats of arms that military historians still study and analyse for lessons about tactics and leadership. But excellent soldiers cannot win wars if they are not adequately fed and supplied, if the society supporting them cannot maintain production of essential goods, if the farms and factories and distribution systems that undergird military operations break down or prove inadequate to the demands placed upon them. America's advantage, the factor that ultimately proved decisive despite Germany's early victories and its possession of certain technological advantages at various points in the conflict, lay precisely in those areas that seem boring and unimpressive to casual observers, in the vast agricultural output that kept people fed, in the manufacturing capacity that could produce weapons and vehicles and ammunition in quantities that overwhelmed enemies through sheer volume, even when individual items might be inferior in some technical specifications, in the logistical networks that moved supplies across oceans and continents with remarkable efficiency despite the complexity and scale of the undertaking. The cafeteria where German prisoners encountered abundance was not an isolated phenomenon or a special case created to impress or intimidate, but rather a small visible manifestation of a much larger system, a tiny window into the productive capacity of an entire continental economy that had been mobilized for war without destroying itself in the process, that could simultaneously fight on multiple fronts while maintaining civilian living standards at levels the Axis powers could not match even in peacetime. The prisoners who experienced this abundance, who filled their trays with more food than they had seen in months and then returned for seconds and thirds, were encountering proof that their ideology had been built on fundamentally false assumptions about the sources of national strength and the characteristics that make societies powerful or weak. They had been taught that discipline and hierarchy and proper understanding of racial differences would give Germany advantages that could not be overcome by nations that embraced democracy and equality and other such weak sentiments, that German organization and German thoroughness and German cultural superiority would prove decisive in any sustained conflict with peoples who lacked these qualities. The reality they encountered in American prison camps demonstrated that these assumptions were wrong, that abundance and democratic distribution of resources could generate power that hierarchical systems could not match, that treating people as individuals with agency and choice might actually produce better outcomes than treating them as units to be directed and controlled by superior authorities who knew what was best for everyone. This lesson was painful to absorb because it required abandoning deeply held beliefs, questioning assumptions that had been woven into their understanding of themselves and their place in the world since childhood, admitting that perhaps they had fought for a cause that was not only morally wrong, which many of them came to accept over time, but also practically foolish, based on misunderstandings about how the modern world actually worked and what factors truly mattered in determining which nations would succeed and which would fail. The cafeteria became for many of them a symbol of this painful education, a physical space where illusions were shattered meal by meal, where pride gave way to confused acceptance of realities that contradicted everything they thought they knew. An old soldier's memory of trays sliding along rails, of milk flowing freely, of bread piled in baskets that never seemed to empty, these simple images carried more weight in his understanding of why Germany lost the war than any analysis of specific battles or strategic mistakes, because they revealed the fundamental imbalance in productive capacity that made defeat inevitable once the conflict became a test of endurance rather than a quick, decisive campaign. History, we must conclude as we finish this account, is indeed often taught through noise and spectacle, through the dramatic events that capture attention and dominate memory, through moments of crisis and violence that seem to define eras and shape destinies. But sometimes, perhaps more often than we recognize, history's most important lessons come quietly, delivered in unremarkable settings where ordinary activities reveal extraordinary truths about power and society and human nature. The roar of cannons matters, certainly, and the thunder of aircraft engines, and the shouts of soldiers advancing into battle. All of these things shape outcomes and determine fates in ways that cannot be dismissed or minimized. Yet the clatter of trays in a cafeteria, the steam rising from pans of food, the sight of abundant provisions offered even to enemies, these too are part of the story, perhaps the deeper part, the element that explains not just how battles were won, but why the war could have only one possible outcome once both sides were fully committed to total conflict. For the German prisoners who lived this experience, who passed from mockery to shock to acceptance over the course of their captivity, the cafeteria remained a memory more vivid than most battlefields, a recollection that retained its power to disturb and provoke thought long after other wartime experiences had faded into vague impressions of fear and exhaustion and confusion. They had entered those doors expecting humiliation and had encountered instead a revelation about the true nature of strength in the modern age, about what separates winners from losers in conflicts between industrial societies. Their proud traditions of table ritual, those carefully preserved ceremonies involving wine and sausages and hierarchical seating arrangements, had seemed so important, so central to their identity as Germans and as civilized people. Yet these traditions had proven fragile when confronted with simple abundance democratically distributed, with systems designed to feed masses efficiently rather than to preserve distinctions and reinforce social order. And so we leave these men, these prisoners who became in their own way teachers, though they did not choose this role and probably would have refused it if asked, having learned lessons through hard experience that they then carried back to Germany and passed on, often unconsciously, to children and grandchildren who grew up in a very different nation than the one their elders had fought for. We leave them with their memories of bright lights and steel trays and more food than they had imagined possible, memories that challenged and changed them in ways that shaped not just their individual lives, but contributed, in small ways difficult to measure or quantify, to Germany's eventual transformation into a different kind of society, one that rejected the ideologies their generation had served and built instead on different principles, drawing perhaps on lessons learned in unexpected places like American prison camp cafeterias, where abundance had proven more powerful than any weapon, and democracy had revealed itself not as weakness, but as a source of tremendous practical strength that hierarchical systems simply could not match or overcome.